Good morning, morning. Good morning, morning.
Viewers, welcome back. Welcome back to the morning show here on Tobago Updates Television as we dive right into conversations, ready to take you through the show. We are speaking to Senator Melanie Radgman, an attorney at law, as we talk about this recent Stand Your Ground legislation that was passed. Senator, good morning.
Good morning, Lavion, and good morning to all of viewers in Tobago and Trinidad and across the world.
All right, great. So, Senator, I know that recently we would have had the Attorney General, John Jeremy. He said that the opposition is trying to convince the public that the bill only serves a certain class and socioeconomic group in society. What are your views on that?
All right, so here's the thing, Lavion. Legislation is serious business. It affects the lives of persons to whom it applies to. So it's important that when we legislate, we make the population understand exactly what we're doing and the impact it has on them. Now, when the opposition spoke about the impact, the disproportionate impact of the negative outcomes of this bill, when we said that it disproportionately affects certain segments in society, here's what we meant. And we could take this several ways because I would have made my contribution in the Senate on Tuesday and then we return on Friday to complete the contributions. And we would have heard similar sentiments being also expressed and similar concerns even by independent senators. So here's the reality. The Stand Your Ground bill allows a homeowner or an occupier, lawful occupier of a property, of a home, to use reasonable force to defend him or herself or others or your property against a home invader, so someone who breaks into your home. The reality is, for most people, especially when you think about the older or you think about women or the more vulnerable in society, we are not able to use reasonable force to thwart a hardened, seasoned criminal. The best chance you have of doing that is with a firearm, using a bat or a knife or something of the sort where you have to be in close combat, close proximity, puts the homeowner at a disadvantage. For most people, it might be true for stronger people or trained people, but for the average person, your best bet is a firearm. The question has been raised, I asked the question in the Senate as well, how many persons hold FULs at this point in time? The next question is, even if a person becomes a FUL holder, how easy or how accessible is the purchase of a legitimate firearm for such persons? Then the next question becomes, does the average homeowner have the right sort of environment to secure a firearm in their home from children, from intruders, from other persons in the household? The reality is that the majority of persons do not possess licensed firearms. It means that even when you apply this bill, these Stand Your Ground provisions, and let me put a plug in there and say that the self-defense already exists in common law. The right to defend yourself already exists in common law. But nonetheless, when you pilot this bill, or when you have this bill now, what it does is it favors the firearm users, obviously. So persons who already hold a firearm, it's easy enough for them to then defend themselves. But for persons who are not firearm users, and that's the majority of the population, it still puts you at a disadvantage. The other thing that we have to think about now is that you're going to have home invaders breaking in with a kill or be killed mentality. They're coming expecting that home owners are going to defend themselves. So they're coming in prepared to take very decisive action against you. So those are the sort of disproportionate impacts that you see such a piece of legislation having. So that was the point that we were trying to make, considering that the likelihood of you being able to defend yourself successfully increases with you having a licensed firearm, and considering that the majority of people do not hold a licensed firearm, it still puts you at a disadvantage. And then when we start talking about socioeconomics, we cannot avoid or ignore the fact that most firearm holders, licensed firearm users and holders, come from a certain segment of society. The lower class, and the middle to lower class persons do not have access to licensed legal firearms. They're not FUL holders. It's mostly upper class persons that you see holding licensed firearm, having a license to hold a firearm. So that is where the argument was being made that it actually disproportionately favors persons in what we would call upper middle class or upper class society.
Senator, from your legal perspective, because this morning you're wearing both hats, Senator and Attorney at Law, and recently we had Captain Gary Griffith on, and he spoke to his belief that most persons, the average person, is not quite aware of what they can and cannot do, and they believe that they could Wild West the thing.
Yeah.
I want to read something for you that the Attorney General said, and if you could bring some clarity for homeowners that might have to engage. He said, for example, if an occupant is safely locked in a heavily burglar-proofed and alarmed house and sees a person standing in his front yard and proceeds to shoot at the person and kills him, is it reasonable to say in those circumstances that because the occupant has no duty to retreat, his actions were necessary and proportionate to the threat he believed to exist? My question there is, how are we going to differentiate? Was that threat really a threat? What now would the magistrate be looking at? What are the variables, and where does that leave the homeowner?
Exactly. So see, and actually this is an excellent question. And this is the thing. So under this piece of legislation, there's no duty to retreat, right? So it gives persons the impression that once you're in my yard, once you're on my property, even if I am safe, even if I could maybe go through a back step or lock up or activate my alarm, I still have the right to stand my ground. I can still attack you. Now, to be very honest with you, in determining whether or not reasonable force was used, the court has to also consider a series of factors. And one of the factors to be considered, among many, I think this stands at K, like subfactor K in the bill that was brought to the Parliament. One of the factors is whether or not the the homeowner, who would now become the defendant, by the way, in a criminal matter, because you will have to go through the process. The homeowner now, one of the questions is whether or not the homeowner could have reasonably retreated. So that would still be one of the considerations, and people need to be aware of that the court will take into consideration also, could you have retreated? It is one of many, many, many factors. And I guess it would take it would be one of those things that the fact-finding tribunal would have to go through to make a determination on, but it is one of many factors to be considered by the court, whether or not you could have safely or reasonably retreated under the circumstances.
Senator, I just want to raise a number of issues, because I was looking at a commentator on the issue on social media recently, and it stated that there are a lot of issues with the bill in terms of lack of definition of some of the frame terms, and which leads a lot of things to be open to interpretation, such as being in fear of your safety or fear of your life, as well as the definition of, and I'm paraphrasing here, a definition of the castle domain. You can now claim part of your property or your castle domain as associate if you live in like gated communities. The communal properties are now part of your jurisdiction to where you can utilize the firearm should you feel threatened. And it's not only in your house or in your property.
Exactly, and actually, Akinlabi, I'm glad that you raised that, because this was one of the points that I would have raised in the Senate. When you look at the definitions of dwelling house, when you look at the definitions of, for instance, curtilage is what they're calling it. That's how it's defined in the bill, right? Your curtilage, so your yard space, the bits of land or surrounding areas of your home, of your property, right? That's what they're referring to as curtilage. And there's so many new ones that works almost perfectly well in a gated community, or even in those communities where your boundaries are very clearly demarked. Everyone has a fence, you have a gate, and I know exactly where my land starts and where it stops, and where your land starts and where it stops. But when you don't even have to look at apartments. Let's just look at how we live in Tobago, for instance, where there are several homes in one yard and all that space is shared. How then do you make a determination that, okay, this person was standing his ground because this is his property, as opposed to his cousin whose house is right next to him, or his brother or his neighbor whose house is right next to him? How do you make a determination of whose property it is? The reality is, in Tobago, you have a piece of land, mommy say, all right, you're married now, build something behind there. Okay, you big enough now, you chuck something down there. And all these spaces tend to be shared. We have a lot of communal spaces, and they're not public spaces. Nonetheless, they're still considered private property, but they're shared private property. How do you then make a determination? And I imagine that any fact-finding tribunal will have quite a bit of difficulty determining whether or not a person actually was on their property when they stood their ground. And therein lies the mischief, because what you have now is that otherwise innocent homeowner who tried to defend himself, something that the state should have been doing for him, he has now defended himself, and he now has to stand before court. He has to go through this entire criminal prosecution process, probably get an attorney, and now prove to the court that actually I was on my property. So you give them double the burden.
Another thing that Captain Gary Griffith would have raised in our interview with him earlier this week was that he does not believe that the state has taken enough caution to do the proper assessments of persons who might be applying, as well as to make sure that they're well trained and they're well prepared to understand the immense responsibility they now have with a firearm. Does the legislation speak to that? Do you believe the legislation speaks to that?
Absolutely not. It does not. To be very honest with you, let me be transparent here. When the Attorney General piloted the bill in the Senate, he did say that there would be other interventions being taken by the government. We haven't seen those interventions, so maybe this is a case of the cart before the horse. Perhaps this is one of the things that needed to be addressed first. First, we look at access to firearms, to legal firearms. We look at the process for screening. And for me, it's not just about background screening when you initially apply for a firearm, but also ongoing screening, because your circumstances change, your mental capacity change, your household changes, whatever you're going through changes, your physical ability to even operate a firearm changes. So I would say, in addition to your background screening, you also need to have ongoing screening, ongoing reporting happening, and then ongoing training to be able to operate a firearm. This isn't addressed in the legislation. I think we should have seen more of these interventions taking place first before we bring this type of legislation. What I think the government should have done is, one, to educate homeowners about their common law rights as it exists right now, and then also take other interventions for the state to address issues of home invasion, crime, criminality, so police detection rates, police response rates, how fast. You hear so many homeowners say, when there's an incident, you call the police and it takes forever for them to come. How responsive have the police been? What are the factors affecting responsiveness? Is it availability of vehicles? Is it staffing shortages? These are the things I think should have been addressed before you take the responsibility of fighting crime and place it in the hands of unsuspecting and innocent homeowners who are not trained, who are not equipped, and who are not ready to defend themselves against hardened criminals in the event of a home invasion.
Senator, we're speaking about stand your ground to protect your life, but there's also a part of the bill, stand your ground to protect your property. The use of deadly force to protect property which we in Trinidad and Tobago grew up in a society where we say, once your life saved, you could buy that back. The Attorney General said that the bill, well, I know the Law Association and the opposition were opposed to that part, yeah? But the Attorney General, he said that the bill does not give homeowners the right to use unfettered force to protect property. Your views on that, Senator?
It actually does. It allows you to kill a home invader. It allows you to kill someone to protect your property. And that's where the constitutionality issue comes in. And that's where you hear independent senators, you hear the opposition, you hear the Law Association, Law Reform Commission, all cautioning against such a dangerous stance. Because something else that we have to remember as well. And let me actually let me give you 2 or 3 examples that we have seen play out right here in the Tobago space. Because when I talk about these things, I don't like to speak in hypotheticals. I need people to understand exactly what we're looking at and how this plays out. In April of this year, we had an incident where a young man was allegedly, we are not sure, but it was alleged that he broke into the home of a police officer. He may have stolen stuff. The police officer then retaliated subsequently, and while the young man was in handcuffs, he was shot dead. His life was taken in defense of property. We had another incident right after that in May in Mount St. George, where an older gentleman, a bit confused, opened the door, attempted to open the door of his neighbor. He was confused and he was shot dead on the spot, again in defense of property. Very innocent, no wrongdoing, property was not even jeopardized, and he was shot dead. We also saw footage being circulated a few months ago where 2 neighbors, I think it was in Canby, where one neighbor, a licensed firearm user, was brandishing his firearm, threatening his neighbor. They had a dispute over a fence. Again, property. So you understand the kind of challenges we have and the kind of slippery slope we're going down already. We don't even have this legislation in place. But in Tobago alone, we've seen 2 fatalities and almost a 3rd fatality on account of persons trying to defend their property with the use of firearms. And actually the law does allow you, unfortunately, well, the bill, because it has not yet been passed in the Senate. I imagine by tomorrow it'll be a different story. But for now, the bill allows a homeowner to use defensive force to protect, deadly force to protect his property.
Right. And Senator, I want to ask you, do you think that this bill is redundant? Do you think that we already have laws in place to protect homeowners to deal with home invasions, and this bill, it was just a part of a campaign and we have to see it through? What are your thoughts on that?
Lavion, I feel like you was peeping in on my presentation, on my contribution on Tuesday in the Senate. And that's one of the things that I said, and I think another senator mentioned it as well. And we call it a legislative surplus. You already have the common law to defend yourself. It already exists. Persons, and we would have seen a few cases popping up where persons, especially licensed fire officers, would have used deadly force to defend themselves against, and we, to some extent, you hear the population celebrating it and saying, good for you, yeah, fight back Tanti or fight back Pops. I think in Tobago we had an incident this year as well where a homeowner business user actually used his licensed firearm and was successfully able to defend. So it already exists in the law. The common right to defend oneself from an attack in your home already exists. That's already in the law. I don't think that we needed this piece of legislation. I think it's deadly. It is dangerous in that it unnecessarily heights the population, and the way in which the government conducted their consultations, and the way they advertised this bill, because it was a campaign promise and they're so harped and bent on this whole promise made, promise delivered, they did not spend enough time really educating the population about what the bill contains, but more so they gave the impression that you could just shoot a man down. So what you're going to see happening is a lot of vigilante justice. You're going to see a lot of people overzealous. You're going to see a lot of people misusing and misapplying this legislation to further maybe their own agendas, or because they think that they're superheroes and they could just go out there and do whatever. It's going to be dangerous. And I imagine as well, let me also put this caution in there, that I suspect. Go ahead. Sorry, Akinlabi, go ahead.
Senator, no, I was just going to jump off the point that you were making there, in that there are a lot of persons who oppose the bill saying that it feels like a copy and paste of these stand your ground laws. It's very controversial in states like Florida in the United States, and that nowhere sort of care was taken to craft it properly for our society. What are your comments on that?
Yeah, of course not. That's and as much as the government tries to stay away and tries to say that they have not copied the Florida model, yes, you're quite right. It is a copy and paste. It does not take into account our specific nuances here in Trinidad and Tobago, especially in more traditional type communities. So your communities in the eastern part of Tobago, for instance, or even your communities in the middle to lower income parts of Trinidad. It doesn't take into account the nuances in those communities. And as you mentioned, the Florida model and models from throughout the US, it must also be noted that the research data coming out from those states have shown that stand your ground laws and even castle laws do not reduce the occurrence of home invasions. It does not reduce the occurrence of crime. What it does actually is it increases the occurrence of wrongful deaths as a result of careless mistakes, racial profiling, discrimination, that kind of thing. Those are the kind of ills that you see coming out of states that have this kind of legislation.
And before we wrap up, is there a sunset clause to this law?
No, unfortunately, no.
All right, thank you very much, Senator. And we're going to take a short break, and when we return, we're going to continue conversations with the Senator, and we're going to raise the issue of concerns over the radar at the A&R Robinson International Airport. So do us a favor. Share the live, share the live, share the live. When we come back, we continue our conversations with Senator Radgman.